When I was growing up in the 50s, over 90% of America identified as Christian, and a good half of those were, 60% almost, were in worship on a given weekend. Now, those numbers have changed significantly in the last 70 years. And now it's about 63% identify as Christian, and about half of those are in worship on a given Sunday. What's happened? Have we had an invasion of people who are agnostic or atheist? No. Have we had some kind of proof given to us that there is no God and that people are giving up on it? No. I think what happened is we have, in our country, gone from being a Christian nation, identifying as such, open to other people all the time. You be whatever you want. Well, you want to be an atheist or some other religion, fine. But we're grounded on this principle that this was founded as a Christian country and with Christian principles. Well, we've had the breakdown of the family that has just eroded things in education, other places too. And so broken homes, we find people aren't going to church as a family. We aren't raising our children that way, and so these children grow up, and along the way we have stopped being what would be called a Christian nation in that sense. So here we find ourselves in America that is itself a mission field. Whose job is it to tell this generation about Jesus? We have to tell them he is the Son of God. But who does it, how they do it. And so that we're looking at that as we look at Mark chapter 3 today. In the gospel here, we'll find Mark telling us a story, again, about Jesus going to the synagogue and what happens there, some people wanting to confront him. So we begin in chapter 3 with verse 1. Another time he went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. For those of you who do go to church, I would ask you this question. Why do you go? Why do you go to church? Back in the 50s, it might have been, people want to see the Easter hats that somebody else is wearing. I have to be there with friends, which might still be a leading reason for people today. Why do I want to go? Hopefully part of that reason is I want to spend time with God. I want to worship in a community of other believers. But some people have one reason, some have another. And what we see in this passage is some men who were in the synagogue there, and their number one reason was to watch Jesus, to see if they could find a reason to accuse him. They're ready to accuse Jesus of doing wrong. Think of the attitude on their hearts and minds as they're sitting there, they didn't have pews then, but waiting for something to happen where they could get upset about it and be ready to accuse somebody. What a lousy reason for why they're in church that day. So we find ourselves in a situation today where we might find people attending church for the wrong reason all over the world. In Red China, we have people who attend church because they're there on behalf of the government to take notes on who's there and what they're saying. And we might find other countries like that. We might find in North America, there might be people who are attending church there as representatives of some political or secular group, and they're taking notes on who's saying something that's anti-gay or Republican or Democrat, or somebody who wants to somehow say, was this pastor talking about abortion, and we want to make a note of it. Is he on our side or not? And so we realize that there are some places where it is against the law for a preacher to speak against gays in one fashion or another, and he could go to prison for this. And so there's people there pretending to be a worshiper, waiting for a chance to accuse somebody. And this is what happened in that day there with Jesus. And yet, here he finds him in verse 3. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." And so there he is, not on his own, being the center of attention in worship. Imagine him in the middle of a large living room, people sitting all around, waiting to see what would happen next. Verse 4, Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil?" Now this sounds like a question you might ask a kindergarten class. It's pretty easy, isn't it? Should we do good or should we do evil? The response was nothing. There was no response. Jesus continued, "To save life or to kill." And it says here in verse 4, but they remained silent. Those who opposed him could not answer the question because it would have brought out something contrary to what they wanted to see happen that day. Their rules were more important. We'll get on to that in a minute. Verse 5, he looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. This is the only verse in the Bible where we see Jesus being angry. He looks at the stubborn hearts here. There's people so caught up in their own forms of living and wanting to voice that on other people, people who are more concerned about their rules than they are about being with God that day. And he's angry, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. They could not help this man with the shriveled hand, but they didn't want Jesus to do it either, at least not then. If they had been able to help the man, if they had had the power to heal that man that day, would they have done it? No, not on the Sabbath. Obedience to their Sabbath rules was more important to them than anything, including being at worship that day. They're concerned with something else. As that service breaks up that day, we notice in verse 6, then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill him. Now, why would they feel this way? I'll get to a moment on who these people are, the Pharisees and the Herodians. But they went out there just saying, boy, I don't like him either. Let's never invite him to church again. No, it goes past there. They are plotting how to kill Jesus. Now, let's back up to the Old Testament rule that was written and see how these people were thinking and how they applied it. I'm going to send you to Exodus chapter 31. And I'll start at the 14th verse. Observe the Sabbath, because it is holy to you. Anyone who desecrates it must be put to death. Whoever does any work on that day must be cut off from his people. For 6 days work is to be done, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the 7th day, the Sabbath day, must be put to death. The Israelites are to observe the Sabbath, celebrating it for generations to come as a lasting covenant. Some people take this and interpret it in such a way that there were soldiers in the Israeli army during their war for independence that would fight but only 6 days a week, and they wouldn't even defend themselves on the Sabbath day because they didn't want to break this law. It all comes down on this law to whoever does any work on that day. We're not supposed to be trying to figure out how to make money, do business, or something like that. I'm supposed to reserve a day for the Lord. And so the Pharisees wanted to enforce the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, Moses' books, including this passage here. And so they're very strict on their religious interpretations, and they got to decide in their own minds what work is for everybody else. And for them, doing a miracle to help somebody was work. And so we can do those things maybe. Well, they couldn't. But they didn't want Jesus to do it on the Sabbath either. Note in this passage, this should be interesting, Jesus never touched the man, did he? You read it again, if you forgot what I said here. He told the man, just stretch out your hand, and the withered hand was restored. He never touched him, but somehow they decided that this still constituted work that Jesus did. They knew that he was responsible for a miracle. They're willing to agree that a miracle happened, and they want to say, he did it because he told the man to stretch out his hand. They want to identify that as work. That's their strict interpretation. Now let's look at this as one more other point I want to bring up. So the enemies of Jesus felt that he had the power. They went to church that day. If they knew Jesus was coming, which it's assumed here, he was in town, so he's going to show up at Sabbath. They went there knowing he had the power and wondering if he would do something with it on that day. They knew that Jesus had divine power, but still would not submit to his divine lordship. Let's talk now for a moment about Pharisees and Herodians. Pharisees are religious part of Judaism. At that time, they're very strict. We might call them right-wing because they want to literally interpret the Old Testament, at least the first 5 books, very simply, and then take those rules, live by them, and tell other people they should too. These people are very religious. They were the best of their day, the most religious of their day. The Herodians, on the other hand, were not necessarily even Jews. Herod himself was Idumean, but he married a Jew, and he got the Romans to appoint him as a king. So they had a group here, Herodians, and their job was to support Herod being king. And they would do anything to keep him in power because for them, whatever their jobs were, his being in power meant they were still in power. They still had a job. And so the Herodians wanted to keep him on the throne. And if Jesus comes along and he's going to be announced as king or Messiah, that would be a threat. And for these Pharisees to find somebody who is going to break their rules and say, follow me, he's a threat. And so we have a very religious people willing to meet up with the very unreligious people that they found something they had in common, a threat, Jesus. And they had to do something about it to the point where they're ready to kill him. And the Pharisees would justify that by saying, well, see, he broke the Sabbath laws. He does work on the Sabbath. And the Herodians would say, well, he's a threat to Herod and the Romans, so we got to remove that threat. And so we find in verse 7, Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the lake, and a large crowd from Galilee followed. When they heard all he was doing, many people came to him from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and the regions across the Jordan and around Tyre and Sidon. So Jesus pulls back. He's not going to the synagogue now. He doesn't want to meet with these men. He's not trying to start that kind of trouble right now, but doesn't matter. If he goes out to wild places, lonely places, the crowds still come to him. Jerusalem is the center of things there, so it's mentioned there. Also Judea, the area around Jerusalem. And then it mentions also Idumea, which is the region to the south. The regions across the Jordan, which would have been on the east, and Tyre and Sidon are 2 big cities way up in the north. So in other words, that whole Middle East was coming to be with Jesus in spite of the fact that he had his enemies. So because the crowd was coming to him wherever he would meet, and so I would paint you the picture of Jesus on the shore. He comes around the town and the crowds come. And so because of the crowd, he told his disciples to have a small boat ready for him to keep the people from crowding him. They'd just be pushing, trying to get healed. And so Jesus doesn't want to spend all his time doing that. He'd much rather have somebody stay in their physical impairment but get right with God. So he wanted to do the whole crowd here with a message of the good news and forgiveness of sin. And some of them were on their own agenda there, so they're pushing to see him, and he gets away from them by being in a boat to speak instead. So he had healed many, so that those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. Whenever the evil spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." But he gave them strict orders not to tell who he was. He didn't want the demons to do it. He wanted the people to do it. So they were told not to speak. The demons aren't supposed to say it. We are. We recognize they know who it is, and I'm glad they have to say it and submit to him. But we're supposed to be the believers and followers of Christ. We're supposed to be telling the world about him. How can we do this? Is there some new way that we could be looking for in our lives that as an individual I could be proclaiming Christ, or as my family or my church or my country, whatever group it might be in that we're part of it, we're supposed to be looking for ways to share Christ with other people. One more example to show you how this was not an isolated incident that happened that day when Jesus got angry. I ask you to listen to Luke chapter 13. Luke 13, starting at verse 10. On a Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues. Here's a different town. And a woman was there who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, he called her forward and said to her, "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." Then he put his hands on her, and immediately she straightened up and praised God. Indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue rulers said to the people, "There are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath." He wasn't opposed to the woman being healed. He just wanted her to suffer one more day and not have it happen on a Sabbath, because that was contrary to his understanding of the rules. His idea of the rule was more important than the woman's becoming well. The Lord answered him, "You hypocrites! Doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give it water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her?" When he said this, all his opponents were humiliated, but the people were delighted with all the wonderful things he was doing. Why is it important for us to think like this? For us to be declaring who Jesus is. As we look at this story, I see three kinds of people, basically in both of these stories. Three kinds of people. Number one, there's the people in need, like the man with the withered hand, the woman who was crippled a bit by the Spirit. And then the second kind of people would be the people who would not help, and who could not help. And we see there's several examples of some very religious people more concerned about their rules than about their society. And the third kind of people is people who could help and did. Now, in these two passages, that amounts to one person, the Lord Jesus Christ. And here we are today as his ambassadors, his disciples, and now we are not only one, we are one and his church. And so we have this same calling to be able to say, God has called us to do something about situations in our world. And I'm saying go beyond what somebody's saying, oh, I'm going to be doing evangelism. I'm going to invite people to church so the preacher can do something about it. Each of us should be doing something about it. Each of us should be ready to share Christ. And just because you're ready doesn't mean you're going to do it either, does it? We have to be finding situations. And praise God, today we can do more than that. We have a day now that they didn't have then. Christian radio can go beyond the Iron Curtain. We have a day that can go beyond that. And now we have the internet, and people can be putting podcasts and whatever on the internet so that people can find out in any language all around the world what they might do to be saved. And so we're all being called to go beyond what we have done. I'm not opposed to feeding the hungry or giving clothes to the naked or helping people out at times of distress. Spiritual feeding is good. It's a vital thing, but spiritual feeding is the vital thing, not just the physical feeding. We ought to give them the clothes and food, fine. But if we can go beyond that, we're taking people who are just living one more day with a problem they had and still isolated from God, and now all of a sudden it's something else. We can help feed them, but also tell them who Jesus is. Now, we might have our limits, but there are groups in the world today that can help us what we can't do. Groups who translate the Bible in other languages, groups that print Bibles to go to other people, those who distribute Bibles, those who are willing to be in those places to preach. All these kinds of ministry and missionaries are important, and we can do something about it in supporting them, if not joining with them. But somehow or other, we can be telling the world Jesus is the Son of God. It shouldn't just be the demons saying it, and it shouldn't be us being quiet about it too. How can we find some new ways to be sharing our faith with our world? It's such a needy world in spiritual things. So I'd like you to think about, what do you do? What does your church do? What new things could we invent? How new ways that we might be able to share Christ with others? Pray about it. Let the Spirit speak to you and decide it's not time to limit these things. It's time to move on to more. Thank you, Jesus.